She was already dead the night she ran into the forest. She just did not know it yet. Every step Mara took deeper into Blackwood Forest was another step away from the burning house behind her, another step toward something ancient and watching. The trees swallowed her screams. The cold ate through her thin dress. And then she heard it, not the crackling fire, not the distant sirens, but something low and rhythmic moving through the dark. Something breathing. She stopped. Two eyes opened in the darkness ahead. Not the eyes of an animal. Too knowing. Too human. Too gold. And then the growl came, not from ahead of her, but from all around her, as if the entire forest had a throat. She should have run. Every survival instinct she had left screamed at her to run. She did not run. She looked straight into those golden eyes and said, steady as stone, I am not afraid of you. The silence that followed was the most dangerous kind. The kind right before everything changes. If you want to know what happened in that forest, what those golden eyes belonged to, and why Mara waking up alive the next morning was the most terrifying thing that could have happened to her, then stay with me. This story is for the ones who have always believed that love is not gentle. It is a force of nature. It is teeth in moonlight and something that does not ask permission. Subscribe now. New chapters every day and week. Your next obsession starts here. Chapter 1. The Night of Fire. Mara Voss had lived in the town of Greyvale her entire 24 years, without once venturing past the iron fence that marked the edge of Blackwood Forest. The townspeople had rules about the forest. Do not go in after dark. Do not follow sounds. Do not look at the lights that sometimes floated between the trees on full moon nights. And above all, never, under any circumstances, stay inside the forest past midnight. Mara had always been good at following rules. Until the night her stepfather locked her out of the house and set it on fire. It had not been intentional, or so she told herself running across the frozen yard. He had been drinking. He had knocked over the lamp. He had stumbled out the back door before the smoke reached him. He had not looked back to check if she was inside. He never looked back. That was simply who Gerald Voss was. The house went fast. Old timber, dry season, and a November wind that seemed personally offended by warmth. Mara grabbed nothing. She had nothing worth grabbing. She ran in her nightgown and bare feet across the frost-stiff grass, past the garden that had not grown anything in 3 years, through the gap in the iron fence that she had always been careful to step around before. And then she was inside the forest. The temperature dropped immediately, as if the trees were exhaling something colder than ordinary winter air. The ground beneath her feet changed from grass to something soft and dark, like ash, like centuries of leaves pressing down into something almost like earth. She kept moving because moving was the only thing that made sense. She had gone maybe 100 steps before she realized she could no longer see the fire behind her. The trees were too thick, too tall, their branches lacing overhead into a ceiling that blocked even the smoke-stained sky. She slowed. She stopped. She stood in the dark of Blackwood Forest at 11:47 on a November night and finally understood, in the particular way that only arrives after it is too late, that she was completely alone. The first sound came from her left. A branch, heavy and deliberate. Not wind. Not a small animal. Something with weight. Something that chose where to step. She turned. Nothing but dark. The second sound came from her right. Closer. The kind of close that means something is interested in you specifically. She turned again. Still nothing. And then the two gold eyes opened. They were high off the ground, which meant the creature was tall. They were steady and unblinking, which meant it was not afraid. And they were fixed entirely on her, which meant she was, very deliberately, being looked at. Mara Voss had grown up with a man who used fear as a language. She had learned early how to look at something terrifying and make her face say nothing. She used that skill now. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and said the truest thing she could think of. I am not afraid of you. The eyes blinked. Once. Slowly. The way eyes blink when they are surprised. And then the shape behind them moved, and it was massive, and it stepped into the faint light filtering through the canopy above, and Mara Voss looked at it fully and still did not run. It was a wolf. Or it had been. Or it was becoming something else. She could not be certain because the shape kept shifting at the edges, like a thing caught between two states of being. Fur and shadow and something almost like a man beneath it all. 7 feet tall if it was an inch. Shoulders wide enough to fill a doorway. And those eyes, gold as a coin left in the sun, watching her with an intelligence that no animal should have owned. It made a sound. Not a growl. Not quite. Something lower, something that vibrated in her back teeth and settled in her chest like a question. Mara took one step toward it. It flinched back. The enormous creature in the dark of Blackwood Forest flinched away from a barefoot woman in a nightgown. She almost laughed. She did not, because laughing felt like it would break something fragile happening in the air between them. Instead, she said, "I have nowhere to go. My house just burned down. And I am very cold." The gold eyes looked at her for a long time. Then the shape turned and moved deeper into the forest, and after 3 steps it stopped and looked back at her. Mara followed it. She would think about that decision for the rest of her life. Not with regret. With wonder. The specific wonder of a person who realizes, much later, that the moment they chose to follow the monster was the moment their real life began. Chapter 2. The Man in the Cabin. The cabin was not what she expected. She had expected nothing, because nothing about the last hour of her life had offered any framework for expectation. But if she had been pressed, she would have imagined somewhere dark and animal-smelling, full of bones and warning. Instead, the cabin was warm. Firelit. There was a stone hearth with actual logs burning in it, a table with 2 mismatched chairs, a shelf of books, and a wool blanket folded over the arm of a chair as if someone had just gotten up. The creature had not entered with her. She had followed it to the door, and it had stopped outside, and she had gone in alone, and when she turned to look for it, the door had already swung shut behind her. She stood in the warmth and dripped melted frost onto the floorboards and tried to decide if she was grateful or terrified. She settled on both. She was examining the books on the shelf, titles in 3 different languages, when the inner door opened and a man walked out. He was tall. Not 7 feet, but close to 6.5, and built like someone who had spent a very long time carrying heavy things. His hair was dark, nearly black, and cut without ceremony, and his jaw was rough with several days of growth. His eyes, when they found her, were dark brown. Not gold. But there was something behind them, some quality of stillness, that reminded her immediately of the creature in the forest. He was wearing a plain dark shirt and trousers, and he was barefoot, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her with an expression she could not immediately name. It took her a moment to identify it as relief. "You came inside," he said. "Your wolf brought me here," she said. A pause. He moved to the hearth and crouched to add another log without looking at her. "My wolf." The big one. With the gold eyes. She waited. "Is that not what you are?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "My name is Cael. And you are in the middle of Blackwood Forest at midnight in your sleeping clothes. My house burned down." He looked at her then, fully, the way people look when they are deciding how much of what you just said is true. Whatever he found in her face satisfied him. He stood and crossed to a chest near the wall and pulled out a heavy sweater and a pair of wool socks and set them on the table. "Put those on," he said. "I will make something warm to drink." She put them on. The sweater came to her thighs and smelled like cedar and something faintly wild, like night air. He made tea, real tea from actual leaves in an actual pot, and he set 2 cups on the table and sat across from her and said nothing. She wrapped both hands around the cup and drank, and let the warmth move through her, and decided that if he meant her harm, he was taking an extraordinarily long time about it. "How long have you lived here?" she asked. "A long time." "Alone?" "Yes." She studied him. He was perhaps 30, perhaps older, it was difficult to say. His face had the quality of something that had been weathered rather than aged. He kept his eyes on his cup. "You were the wolf," she said. It was not a question. He looked up. "You changed back." When you brought me here. That is why you came out of the back room. Another silence. Long enough that she counted her own heartbeats. 12. 13. Yes, he said. She nodded slowly. All right. That is all you have to say about it? She thought about it. You did not eat me. You brought me somewhere warm. Your books are in 3 languages. She met his eyes. I think I am probably safe. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated than a smile. Something that looked like it had not been on his face in a very long time and was not entirely sure how to behave. You can sleep by the fire, he said. I will take the back room. She slept. Deeply and without dreaming, which she had not done in years. Chapter 3. What the Forest Knows. In the morning, the cabin looked different. More real, somehow. She could see the detail of it now. The careful repairs to the window frame, the neat stack of firewood beside the hearth, the way the books were arranged not by size, but by something else, some logic that was not immediately visible. Cael was outside. She could hear the sound of an axe on wood, steady and unhurried. She pulled the borrowed sweater tighter and opened the door. He was in a small clearing beside the cabin, splitting logs, and he did not look up when she came out, but he stopped after 3 more swings and set the axe down. There is bread, he said. On the table. Thank you. She did not go back inside. She stood in the cold morning air and watched the forest and thought about Grey Vale on the other side of the iron fence. Her stepfather would be hungover. The house would be a ruin. There was nothing there for her that had not already been burned. Can I stay? She asked. He picked up the axe again. For how long? She thought about it. I do not know yet. He split another log. The sound rang clean in the cold air. Then, very carefully, as if the words were something he was not entirely sure he was allowed to say, he said, You can stay as long as you need. She stayed 3 days before she began to understand what Cael was. Not just a man who became a wolf. Something older than that. The forest around the cabin was his, not by deed or ownership, but by something more fundamental. The trees bent toward him when he walked beneath them. The birds quieted when he stopped and listened. The stream that ran 30 yards east of the cabin ran faster on the nights when he was agitated and slower on the mornings when he was calm. She noticed things. She had always been good at noticing things. It was a survival skill she had developed early in a house with a man who needed careful watching. She noticed that he ate very little human food, but was always outside at dawn and dusk. She noticed the way his eyes caught light at the wrong angle sometimes, a flash of gold in dark brown. She noticed that he never slept that she could hear, and that on the second night when she had a nightmare, she woke to find a log on the fire that had not been there when she fell asleep. On the 3rd morning she said, What are you exactly? He considered the question with the seriousness he brought to everything. A guardian, he said finally. That is the closest word. Of the forest? Of this part of it. His jaw tightened slightly. There are things in these woods that would harm people if they came through. I make sure they do not. How long have you been doing that? He looked at the trees. 140 years. She absorbed this. You are 140 years old. Approximately. She looked at him. At the 20-year-old face that was not a 20-year-old face. She thought about 140 years alone in a forest with only the trees and the things that needed keeping back. That sounds very lonely, she said. He did not answer. But the stream, that morning, ran very quietly. Chapter 4. The Pull of the Moon. She went back to Grey Vale on the 4th day. Not to stay. To collect what little remained of her previous life, a bag of clothes from a friend, the small amount of money she kept in a separate account Gerald did not know about, a photograph of her mother who had died when Mara was 7. Gerald was nowhere to be found. The ruin of the house was already being investigated. A neighbor woman named Patrice pulled Mara into a hug and asked where she had been sleeping, and Mara said with a friend and left it at that. She was back at the iron fence by afternoon. She stepped through the gap without hesitating. Cael was waiting 50 yards inside, leaning against a tree with his arms crossed, and he was trying very hard to look like he had not been waiting. You came back, he said. I said I would. He uncrossed his arms. People often say things they do not mean. She walked past him toward the cabin. I am not most people. She heard him follow. The trees closed behind them both. The days took on a shape. She helped him with the cabin because she was not good at being idle. She learned which sections of the forest he patrolled, and she started walking with him, not because he asked her to but because she found herself restless when he was gone. He taught her which plants were edible and which were dangerous and which were something in between, useful in the right circumstances and deadly in the wrong ones. In exchange, she read to him in the evenings. He had the books, but she had gathered from careful observation that reading, for him, was something that required tremendous effort, as if the letters rearranged themselves when he was not watching carefully. She did not ask about it. She simply read, and he sat across from her and listened with his eyes closed and his hands still, which was the only time she ever saw his hands completely still. 2 weeks in, she understood that she was not going back to Greyvale. 3 weeks in, she understood something else. It came on her slowly, the way real things do. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of moments. The particular way he said her name, 2 syllables that sounded different when he said them than when anyone else ever had. The way he always positioned himself between her and any sound he had not yet identified. The careful distance he kept, always exactly far enough away that she would have to choose to close it. She was not unfamiliar with attraction. She was unfamiliar with attraction that felt like gravity. Like something had already been decided and her only job was to catch up to it. The full moon came on a Thursday. She knew it was coming. She had felt him getting quieter all week, more careful, as if he was carrying something delicate. On Thursday afternoon, he told her to stay inside the cabin after dark. His voice was even, but his eyes were doing the thing where the gold showed through the brown. She said she would. She watched from the window. The change, when it came, was not violent. It was almost graceful, the way water becomes ice. He stood in the clearing and looked up at the rising moon, and then he was not standing. He was something older and wilder and enormous, and he turned once toward the cabin window where she watched, and his gold eyes found hers through the glass, and he held her gaze for 3 full seconds before he turned and ran into the trees. She put her hand against the cold glass. She was beginning to understand that she was in a great deal of trouble. Chapter 5. Something that does not ask permission. He came back at dawn. Human again, or human-shaped, which she was learning was not quite the same thing. He was in the clearing washing his hands in a bucket of water when she came out with 2 cups of tea. She held one out to him. He looked at her, startled, as if he had expected her to behave differently. To be frightened, maybe. To keep her distance. He took the cup. They stood in the clearing in the early light and drank their tea, and the birds came back slowly into the trees around them. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "The change?" He considered. "Not anymore. It did, when I was young." "How young were you when it started?" 17. She thought about being 17 and suddenly becoming something massive and other, and having to learn how to come back from it. She thought about doing that alone. "Who taught you?" she asked. "No one." His voice was flat. It was not self-pity. It was just a fact he had made his peace with. "I figured it out." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think you are the bravest person I have ever met." He turned to look at her sharply, as if she had said something unexpected. "I am not brave," he said. "I simply had no other option." She smiled. "That is what bravery is." The silence between them changed texture. It had always been comfortable, their silence, but this was different. This had weight. This was the kind of silence that knows it is a threshold. Cael set down his cup. He turned to face her fully, and she could see him deciding something, some internal argument reaching its conclusion. "You should know," he said carefully, "that what I am does not operate the way human attachment does." She waited. "When someone of my kind forms a bond, it is not a feeling that can be changed or chosen away from. It is permanent." He looked at the trees, then back at her. "It is already beginning. I want you to understand what that means before it goes further." She looked at him for a long moment. His dark hair, his careful eyes, The 140 years of solitude she could see written in the way he held himself. She set down her own cup and took 3 steps toward him. He went perfectly still. She put her hand against his jaw, and he closed his eyes, and she felt the tremor that moved through him at the touch, like a great weight shifting. Then let it go further, she said. He opened his eyes. Gold this time. All the way gold. He covered her hand with his, and the warmth of it traveled up her arm and settled somewhere in her chest, and she knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent her whole life reading dangerous situations correctly, that she was not in danger. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The forest around them was absolutely still. Every bird, every branch, every breath of wind suspended. And then, all at once, everything started again, louder and more alive than before, as if the forest itself had been holding its breath and could finally let it go. Cael pressed his forehead to hers. He said her name. Just her name. The way he always said it, 2 syllables that sounded like no one else had ever quite understood how to say them before him. I have been alone a very long time, he said. Not anymore, she said. Not anymore. 1 year later. Spring came to Blackwood Forest the way it always did, insistently and from the ground up, green pushing through the dark soil before the snow had fully given up. Mara found the first crocus 3 yards from the cabin door and crouched to look at it for a long time. She had a life now. A small and very specific one, nothing like what she had imagined when she was a girl in a house that was never quite safe. She had books and a cabin and a garden she was coaxing into usefulness, and she had a patrol route she knew as well as she had ever known any street in Greyvale. And she had evenings by the fire and mornings with tea and a man made of wildness and century-old patience who said her name like it mattered. She had sent 1 letter to Greyvale. To Patrice, who would talk to people. It said she was well and not to look for her. She did not say where she was. Some things about Blackwood Forest were meant to stay inside it. Cael came out of the trees at the usual time, dawn patrol finished, and stopped when he saw her crouching in the mud looking at the crocus. He said nothing. He came and crouched beside her and looked at the flower. After a moment he said, "It is early. We had frost last week." She said, "Maybe it is stubborn." He looked at her sideways. A glance that had learned, over a year, to carry a great deal. "Maybe," he said, "it knows something we do not." She laughed. The sound rose into the trees and the birds answered it, and the stream a little ways off picked up and ran faster, the way it always did when she was happy. She took his hand. He held it. The forest breathed around them, vast and old and full of things that needed keeping back, and 1 small cabin with a fire always lit, and 2 people who had found each other at the exact wrong moment and made it, somehow, into exactly the right one. The crocus did not care about any of this. It simply bloomed.